Forget what you've seen in movies. Most kids in the Middle Ages were not princes or princesses. They weren't even knights in training, they were peasant children, and their lives were built around one thing: work. A peasant child's day didn't start with a parent gently waking them for school. It started with the sun. As soon as the first light hit the dirt floor of their small one-room hut, they were up. The whole family often slept in the same room, sometimes with the animals in a connected space for warmth. The air would be thick, with the smell of wood smoke, sweat, and livestock. There was no privacy. There was only the family unit and the work that had to be done. The very first jobs of the day fell to the youngest. A small child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, would be sent to fetch water from the village well or a nearby stream. This wasn't a quick trip, the buckets were heavy, and they might have to make several journeys. Another child might be tasked with scattering grain for the chickens or slopping the pigs. They had to collect eggs if there were any. This was crucial work. A lost egg was a lost meal. Breakfast was simple. It was almost always the same thing: a thick stew of grains and vegetables called pottage, or a chunk of dark, coarse bread. There was no sugar for cereal, no orange juice, just what could be grown or stored. And they ate quickly. There was no time to linger. After the small meal, the real work of the day began. And it changed with the seasons. A child's life was tied to the land. They knew the rhythms of planting and harvesting better than they knew any book. In the spring, children would be out in the fields with their parents. They were too small to handle a heavy plow, but they could follow behind, breaking up clumps of dirt with their hands or a small tool. They would help drop seeds into the furrows. It was back-breaking, tedious work that lasted from sunup to sundown. As the crops began to grow in the summer, a child's main job was protection. They would spend endless hours in the fields acting as human scarecrows. Their job was to shout, clap, and run at any bird that tried to eat the precious seeds or sprouts. They'd also be responsible for weeding. This was a job for small hands. They would crawl along the rows, pulling up weeds that threatened the family's food supply. They also took the family's cow or handful of sheep to the common grazing land and watched them all day. It was a lonely job with a lot of responsibility. If a wolf got a sheep, the family's wealth was seriously damaged. Autumn was the busiest time of all. Harvest. Everyone was needed. Children would help their fathers cut the grain with sickles. They would gather the stalks into bundles. The smallest children had a special job called gleaning. After the main harvest was done, they were allowed to go through the fields and pick up any grains that had been dropped. Every single grain mattered. It could be the difference between a full belly and a hungry winter. They also helped gather fruits, nuts, and berries from the woods. Winter was a time of less outdoor work, but it was not a time of rest. The days were shorter and colder. The family spent more time huddled inside their small, dark cottage. The child's work moved indoors. Girls would learn to spin wool into thread using a simple drop spindle. It was a skill they'd use for the rest of their lives. Boys would help their fathers mend tools, carve wooden pegs, or repair fences. They would feed the animals and make sure they were safe from the cold. What about school? For a peasant child, school was the field, the forest, and the home. They learned by watching and doing. Their parents were their teachers. They learned how to predict the weather by looking at the sky. They learned which plants were safe to eat and which were poison. They learned how to care for animals, how to mend a fence, and how to make what they needed from what they had. Reading and writing were not part of their world. There was no need for it. Their knowledge was practical, passed down through generations. The village church was the only real break from this routine. On Sundays, the family would go to Mass. The priest was probably the only person in the village who could read. The church was the center of social life. It was where you heard news, saw your neighbors, and marked the holidays. These festival days, Christmas, Easter, were rare and cherished moments of rest and celebration. A child might get a special treat, like a small piece of meat or a sweet cake. Discipline was strict and physical. If a child shirked their duties or disobeyed, they would be hit. It wasn't seen as cruel. It was seen as necessary. In a life where a moment of laziness could lead to starvation, there was no room for error. You learned to do your job without complaint. Childhood, as we think of it, was very short. By the age of 7, a child was considered a small adult capable of contributing real labor. By their early teens, they were doing the work of a full-grown man or woman. Their world was small. Most peasants never traveled more than a few miles from the village where they were born. Their life was laid out for them from birth. They would work the same land as their parents, and their children would do the same after them. It was a hard life, full of work and obligation, but it was also a life lived within a strong family and community, a life connected to the earth and its seasons. That was the reality for the vast majority of medieval kids. Life for a child born into nobility was a world away from the farm. It wasn't a life of ease, but it was a life of structure, expectation, and education. A noble child's day wasn't about surviving. It was about preparing. They were being molded from birth to rule, to manage, and to hold power. Their morning started early too, but not with chores. It began with prayer. A priest or chaplain would lead the family in morning mass, held in the private chapel of their castle or manor house. Religion was central to their identity. It taught them their place in the world, a world they believed God had chosen them to lead. After prayers came the first meal of the day. It was far more substantial than a peasant's breakfast. There might be bread made from fine white flour, some cheese, and perhaps leftover meat from the previous night's dinner. They ate at a long table in the great hall, learning from a very young age the proper way to sit, eat, and behave. Manners were everything. Then the lessons began. A noble child did not work in the fields. They worked with their minds and bodies in a different way. A private tutor, often a priest or a clerk, would teach them. Boys and girls would learn to read and write, at least to some degree. They would study Latin, the language of the church and of law. They would learn basic arithmetic, enough to manage household accounts or an estate's finances. From here, their education split by gender. The goal for a girl was to become a capable lady, a valuable asset in a political marriage. She learned how to run a household. This wasn't just simple cooking and cleaning. She was learning to manage a massive operation laws, a castle or manor, with dozens of servants, guards, and workers. She needed to know about storing food for winter, managing supplies, and directing staff. She would also learn skills considered feminine and refined embroidery, singing, dancing, and playing a musical instrument like a lute or a harp. These skills made her more desirable as a wife, which was crucial for forging alliances between powerful families. Her entire childhood was an apprenticeship for marriage. The boy's education was an apprenticeship for war and leadership. His journey began around the age of 7, when he might be sent away from his family to serve in the household of another powerful lord. This was called fostering, and it was a common practice. It built alliances and taught the boy discipline and loyalty to someone other than his parents. He started as a page. As a page, his life was one of service and observation. He would serve the lord and lady at the dinner table, learning etiquette by watching them. He would run messages, care for their clothes, and help them dress. But his training for knighthood also began. He learned to ride a horse. He practiced with wooden swords and small shields, fighting mock battles with other pages. He was taught the basics of hunting and falconry, skills essential for a nobleman. Around the age of 14, if he proved worthy, the page became a squire. This was a major step up. But the squire was a knight's personal assistant. His duties were much more serious. He was responsible for his knight's armory, keeping it clean, polished, and free of rust. This was a huge task. A full suit of armor was complex and expensive. He also cared for his knight's warhorse, a powerful and valuable animal. The squire's combat training intensified. He now trained with real weapons, the sword, the lance, the mace. He learned how to fight on horseback. He accompanied his knight to tournaments, which were a combination of sport and military training. And most importantly, he followed his knight into actual battle. He stood by his side, ready to hand him a fresh weapon or help him if he fell. His own life was on the line. He was learning warfare by living it. If he served with honor and courage, he might one day be knighted himself, in a solemn ceremony where his lord would tap him on the shoulder with a sword. The noble child's world was governed by a strict code of conduct. They were taught about chivalry, courtesy, and their obligations to their people. Of course, this was often an ideal that wasn't met in reality. Discipline was harsh. A mistake in etiquette or a failure in training would be met with sharp words or a physical blow. The pressure to succeed was immense. For a boy, the future of his family's name and lands rested on his shoulders. For a girl, a powerful marriage could secure her family's fortunes for a generation. Their clothing and food reflected their status. Unlike the single rough tunic of a peasant child, a noble child had different clothes for different occasions, made of finer materials like wool, velvet, and even silk, dyed in bright colors. Their meals included a lot of meat venison, boar, swan, dots, and fish, often seasoned with expensive spices that came from far away. A noble child's day was a long, disciplined rehearsal for the life they were born into. It was a life of privilege, but also one of heavy responsibility. They were not free to choose their own path. Their path was chosen for them the moment they were born. Their day was not spent worrying about the next meal, but preparing for the next tournament, the next lesson, or the next war. Between the farmer in the field and the lord in the castle was another kind of medieval kid, the town child. Their world wasn't made of mud and manure, nor was it made of tapestries and tutors. Their world was made of cobblestones, crowded streets, and the constant noise of commerce. A town child's life was about learning a trade. Life in a medieval town was cramped and busy. The streets were narrow, and houses were built tall and close together. The air was filled with a mix of smells: baking bread from the baker's shop, hot metal from the blacksmith, tanning leather, and the ever-present stench of garbage and human waste thrown into the street. A child growing up here learned to be quick on their feet and aware of their surroundings. For most town children, their destiny was tied to a craft or a trade. Formal schooling was rare, though some boys who were destined for the church or a merchant's life might attend a small grammar school to learn basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. For the vast majority, education was a hands-on apprenticeship. This journey often began around the age of 7, but more commonly around 12. A child would be legally bound to a master craftsman for a set period, usually about 7 years. The child's parents would pay a fee to the master. In return, the master agreed to house, feed, clothe, and train the apprentice. The apprentice, in turn, agreed to work for the master without pay. They became part of the master's household, living and eating with his family and any other apprentices. The first years of apprenticeship were not glamorous. The new apprentice was given the most menial jobs. If you were apprenticed to a baker, you wouldn't start by learning to knead dough. You'd start by sweeping the floor, fetching water, and hauling sacks of flour. If you were apprenticed to a weaver, you'd spend your days cleaning the looms and winding yarn onto bobbins. It was hard, repetitive work, designed to teach discipline and obedience. As the years went on, the apprentice was slowly taught the secrets of the trade. The master would demonstrate techniques, and the apprentice would watch and practice. A blacksmith's apprentice would learn how to manage the fire in the forge, then how to use a hammer, then how to shape a simple object like a nail. A shoemaker's apprentice would learn how to cut leather, then how to stitch it, then how to attach a sole. Mistakes were common, and they were often met with a cuff to the head. The master's word was law. The system was controlled by powerful organizations called guilds. Each trade had its own guild doll: the Weaver's Guild, the Baker's Guild, the Goldsmith's Guild. These guilds set the standards for quality, controlled prices, and decided who could become a master. An apprentice's entire future depended on satisfying their master and eventually the guild. What about girls? Girls could also be apprentices, though their options were often more limited. They were frequently apprenticed in trades seen as women's work. A girl might become an apprentice to a seamstress, a spinner, or a brewer. And alabrewing, in fact, was a trade dominated by women, known as alewives. Girls also worked in their family's business, learning to manage the shop front, deal with customers, and keep the accounts while their father or brother worked in the back. Their training was just as serious and just as vital to the family's income. The town child's day was long. They rose before dawn to help their master prepare for the day. They worked until dusk, with a short break for a midday meal. The food was better than a peasant's, more variety, with meat and cheese being more common, but it was still simple fare. In the evening, there might be a little time for leisure, but often there was more work to be done, like cleaning tools or preparing materials for the next day. The life in town offered something that was rare for a peasant: a chance to move up in the world. After completing their apprenticeship, an apprentice became a journeyman. As a journeyman, they could travel and work for other masters, earning a daily wage. They honed their skills and saved their money. The ultimate goal was to become a master craftsman themselves. To do this, a journeyman had to produce a masterpiece, a single piece of work that proved their skill to the guild. If the guild approved it, and if they had enough money to open their own shop, they could become a master. They could then take on their own apprentices, and the cycle would continue, but town life also had its dangers. Overcrowding meant that disease could spread like wildfire. The Black Death was devastating in towns and cities. A fire was another constant threat. With houses made of wood and packed tightly together, a single spark could burn down an entire neighborhood in hours. A town child learned to be wary of these dangers from a young age. So, the day of a town child was one of labor, learning, and ambition. It was a life lived within the strict rules of the guild and the master's household, but one that held the promise of a better future. They weren't learning to fight or to farm. They were learning to make, to build, and to sell. They were the engine of the medieval economy, learning the skills that built the cathedrals, shod the horses, and clothed the people. Living in a castle wasn't just for princes and princesses. A medieval castle was a bustling, self-contained community, a military fortress, and a center of government, all in one. And it was filled with children from every level of society, each with a very different daily experience. Let's start with the child of a high-ranking noble, the lord of the castle himself. We've seen their life of lessons and training, but living within the castle walls gave that life a specific flavor. Their playground was the battlements and courtyards. Their world was defined by the thick stone walls around them. They grew up hearing the sounds of soldiers training, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer on armor, and the arrival of messengers and important guests. Their education was not just from tutors, it was from observing the constant political and military activity happening around them. Then there were the children sent to the castle to be trained the pages and squires. A boy serving as a page in a great castle would have a day packed with duties. He'd wake early and attend to the lord and lady, perhaps helping them dress or bringing them their morning meal. He would then spend hours in the great hall, learning how to serve food and wine properly during banquets. This was a critical skill. He had to be quick, quiet, and invisible, all while watching and learning the complex etiquette of the high table. In the afternoon, his training would shift to more martial pursuits in the courtyard, practicing swordplay with other pages under the watchful eye of a knight. His life was a constant performance, a test of his manners and potential. A girl sent to the castle as a lady-in-waiting had a similar life of service and education. She would serve a high-ranking lady, helping her with her clothes, her hair, and her correspondence. She was there to learn the arts of courtly life, music, embroidery, and the subtle dance of conversation and politics. She was in a prime position to be noticed by powerful men and secure a good marriage, which was the ultimate goal of her placement in the castle. For both pages and ladies in waiting, being in a castle was like being in the ultimate finishing school. But these noble children were just a fraction of the kids in a castle. A castle needed a huge number of people to function, and many of them had families. There were the children of the knights and men-at-arms who garrisoned the fortress. These boys might not have the formal path of a page, but they would still grow up surrounded by military life. They would play with wooden swords, mimicking the soldiers they saw every day. They learned to ride and shoot a bow at an early age. Their path was often set. They would become soldiers like their fathers. Then there were the children of the servants and craftsmen. The castle had its own cooks, bakers, laundresses, grooms, blacksmiths, and carpenters. The children of these workers lived within the castle walls, but had a life much closer to that of a town child. A cook's son would spend his day in the hot, smoky kitchen, starting with simple tasks like turning a spit or peeling vegetables. He was learning his father's trade on the job. A stableman's daughter might help by cleaning stalls and grooming the horses. These children did not receive lessons in Latin or etiquette. Their school was the workplace of their parents. They lived in the less grand parts of the castle, in small chambers or attic rooms. They ate in the servants' area of the great hall, not at the high table. They saw the lords and ladies from a distance. Their world was one of hard work, defined by the hierarchy of the castle. Everyone knew their place. The stable girl did not speak to the lord's daughter unless spoken to first. Despite these sharp social divisions, all castle children shared the unique environment. They understood the rhythm of castle life, the changing of the guard, the raising and lowering of the portcullis, the preparations for a feast or a siege. A siege was a terrifying time for everyone. The gates would be barred and the castle would become a crowded, isolated world. Food and water would be rationed. The children would be put to work carrying messages, fetching water, or tending to the wounded. The fear was real and constant. The stone walls that were their home became their only protection from the enemy outside. The castle child's day, regardless of their station, was steeped in the purpose of the building itself. It was a place of power, defense, and administration. Whether you were a squire learning to wield a lance or a baker's boy learning to knead dough, your life was part of the larger machine that kept the castle running and its lord in power. Your day was structured, disciplined, and lived in the shadow of the great stone keep. No matter if they lived in a drafty hut, a bustling town, or a stone castle, medieval kids were still kids. And when they weren't working, they played. Their games and toys were simple, often homemade, and fueled by imagination. But their path to adulthood was short and shadowed by the constant threat of illness and death. Play was squeezed into the moments between work. A peasant child watching sheep might pass the time by carving a whistle from a piece of wood. Children in a town street would use a discarded barrel hoop, rolling it with a stick in a game of chase. Sticks became swords, rocks became balls. Toys were rarely bought. They were made. A mother might sew a simple doll from scraps of cloth, stuffing it with straw or wool. A father might carve a wooden horse or a set of toy soldiers. One of the most common toys was a ball, often made from an inflated pig's bladder wrapped in leather. With this simple ball, they could play catching games or a rough and tumble early version of football where an entire village might compete against another. Games were often physical and mimicked the adult world. Boys wrestled and had mock fights pretending to be knights. They played games of tag and hide and seek. Girls played with their dolls, acting out the domestic life they saw around them. The board games were popular too. Nobles might play chess, a game of strategy that mirrored warfare. But a much more common game, scratched into dirt, stone, or a wooden board, was Nine Men's Morris. It was a simple game of alignment and capture that could be played by anyone, anywhere. For all kids, play was a way to learn skills. Wrestling built strength, running games built stamina. Playing house or market taught social roles. These were not just frivolous pastimes, they were part of a child's education for life. But this brief time of play was set against a very harsh reality. Staying healthy was a matter of luck. The medieval world had no understanding of germs or modern medicine. A simple cut from a rock could become infected and lead to a slow, painful death, as water was often contaminated, leading to outbreaks of dysentery that could kill a child in days. Fevers, coughs, and mysterious plagues swept through communities, and there was little anyone could do. Infant and child mortality rates were staggeringly high. It was common for a family to lose several children before they reached adulthood. Parents loved their children, but they also lived with the constant expectation of loss. This reality shaped the very concept of childhood. Children were not seen as delicate flowers to be sheltered. They were seen as small, incomplete adults. They were expected to be resilient and to contribute to the family as soon as they were physically able. The transition from childhood to adulthood was not a gradual process, marked by years of schooling and self-discovery. It was swift and practical. Around the age of 7, the period of early childhood was considered over. A child was now old enough to be given significant responsibilities, whether it was herding sheep, helping in a workshop, or learning manners as a page. This was the age of reason, as the church called it. You were old enough to be held accountable for your actions. By the time they reached their early teens, they were, for all intents and purposes, adults. A peasant boy of 14 was doing a man's work in the fields. A girl might be married at 12 or 13, especially in noble families where marriages were political arrangements. An apprentice of 15 was a skilled worker, well on their way to mastering their trade. So yeah, there was no teenage phase. You were a child, and then you were an adult with adult responsibilities. So what did a medieval kid do all day? The answer depends entirely on who their parents were. A peasant child worked to feed their family. A noble child trained to lead and fight. A town child learned a trade to make a living. A castle child served and learned within a fortress. Their lives were worlds apart. But in some ways, they were the same. They all lived in a world where family and community were everything. They all learned by doing, not by reading. They all found moments to play, to run, and to imagine. And they all faced the same precarious journey to adulthood, a journey that was much shorter and more dangerous than our own. Their days were filled with work, duty, and the simple, universal struggle of growing up in a difficult world.